Good morning. We are here today to do quite a lot of work on this project, this fantastic project. And what Ursula has asked those of us who are speaking this morning to do is just to simply throw out some ideas that might help stimulate us through the day. So I thought my job is really to frame, it's not to set, although I'm going to end up with something that's very close to a challenge. I thought we should, for the moment, reflect on where we are. Not so much Germany, and anybody who's travelled from Australia knows very well that this is Germany, and it's a long way away from Australia, but I wanted to think more about time. Because in a generation from now, as little as a generation from now, we will look back on this period as a period of revolutionary transformation. Really significant shifts in economic conditions, in cultural conditions, in the nature of life, and as I want to particularly say, in the nature of urban life and life in cities. And whether that change takes place without massive disruption, without huge social conflict, is to me not at all clear at this moment. But I think that probably all of us in this room are convinced and are here in a way because we think that the future can evolve, the revolution can take place if we can adopt things such as this project, if we can be both socially and technically innovative. We might be able to get through the future in relation to the challenges in front of us without the kind of collapse of civilization as we would want it. But it is clear, it seems to me, that one of the things that we, I'm sure, all understand about the nature of change in front of us to respond to the challenges is that we are talking fundamentally about systems change and systems innovation. And we are talking about radical change, disruptive change, changes that are transformative and changes in paradigms from everything that we have experienced in perhaps the last 200 years. So that's the kind of scene. What I would like to do is for a moment talk to you about where I've just come from. If you'll indulge me, this is slightly cathartic because you may not know, but as little as a month ago, Australia voted in a new government, a government of immensely conservative persuasion, a reactionary government that frankly makes many of us in Australia frightened for the future, and a government that overturned the previous 6 or 7 years of government, which in itself had come in on the back of a previous conservative government on the basis of climate change and action on climate change. The previous government, now the one that has just gone, its first action was to ratify Kyoto because Australia had not ratified Kyoto. And it was one of the two countries that when Kyoto was ratified, it changed the program and made it possible. The new government has come in after 6 years of relentless attack on the idea of some of the things that the previous government brought in. Like a carbon tax, for example. The previous government had introduced a carbon tax and would, if it had survived, in 1 month's time, have set in place a full trading scheme. And yet we have experienced for 6 years the most extraordinary attack from all quarters, including a whole lot of organizations that came into being. This is the headline of a website that calls itself the Galileo Scientific Society and which purports to represent the falsity of climate change and the economic disaster that they insist would have come from a carbon tax. Australia is a very peculiar place. One of our great contributions, and I say that as sarcastically as I possibly can, to global economics is a guy called Rupert Murdoch, who heads News Corporation, and who started his life with a small newspaper in one of our smallest cities in Australia, now the largest media organisation in the world. And I do hope that you here in Cologne and in much of Germany manage to have media that is not dominated by news media. In Australia, 80% of all media, television, radio, and newspapers that are available to people in our country come from Murdoch's press. And Murdoch, over the last 6 years, has a relentless campaign throughout all of the newspapers and all of its media to represent climate change as the largest the largest trick, the largest, fraud by scientists that has ever been portrayed. And every day in the newspaper, in the major Australian newspaper that covers the whole of Australia, that Rupert Murdoch, thinks of as one of the great newspapers of the world, 8 out of 10 articles on climate change throughout the last 6 years have been negative about how it's a fraud. We've had every climate denier in the world come to Australia and tour the country. Now, I'm emphasizing all of this because it's very hard for me to kind of quite give you the picture of how the last 6 years have been, and I need to because I want to show you something that I think is very interesting. The first thing is that Australia is a mine. Australia has the largest and most accessible coal deposits in the world. It is now the largest exporter of natural gas, projected under this current government to increase over 360% in the next 5 years, much of that from 40,000 leases for unconventional shale gas across the country. So that the power in our country, known by my colleague, or described by my colleague Clive Hamilton as the fossil fuel mafia of the country, power in our country is absolutely rooted in the mining industry and particularly in fossil fuels. And that Murdoch press has done everything it possibly can to represent the change to renewable energies as a threat to the existing infrastructure, the fundamental infrastructure of Australia. The first act of the new government, the very first act, within an hour of being sworn in, was to dismantle the Climate Commission of Australia, set up by the previous government, full of scientists, many of whom are members of the IPCC, but also science communicators, to translate the information about climate change into policy and into things that can be understood by the public. So you get the picture, I hope. I am standing here and I'm thinking, do I really want to go back to this country? You'll see that I do for other reasons. But let me just... thank you. Yes, there are some places that in some respects are rather similar. But let me say that within 3 days of the Climate Commission being dismantled, it was back. And it was back on a crowdfunding scheme in 3 days, with only Facebook and Twitter and the normal social networks. They raised $1 million. By now, I'm sure it's close to double that because the response has been extraordinary. And the agency continues, it now continues as a publicly funded thing. So that's something quite interesting in the context that I've described to you. So is the fact that Australia now has the largest installed residential solar photovoltaic PV systems in the world, even greater than Germany, only because we're talking about residential. In 3 years, starting from something as little as about 10,000 systems on roofs, we now have 1.2 million systems. Now that represents, I might say, something that came as an incredible surprise, a real shock, one of those disruptive things for the existing industry, for the power industry in the country that's nicely based on continued coal-fired baseload power. Suddenly, they now have a completely different element that had come into existence in just 3 years. The amount of electricity being produced by those panels in Australia, remember it's a very sunny country, is now more than the biggest coal-fired power station in the country. And that's happened simply by individuals contributing the capital individually and sometimes as communities and sometimes in crowdsourced and crowd-funded ways to build a new infrastructure. $4 billion as a contribution to the development of the infrastructure of energy in Australia came from individuals. Not from the financial markets, not from the capital markets, but from individuals. So this is disruptive in immense ways. So what on earth is going on? How do we have an election by a landslide of an ultra-conservative government that is focused on so many things that I could spend hours talking about, and yet, and certainly on climate change is crap, as our new Prime Minister once said, certainly that carbon tax and renewable energy is something that is dangerous for the future. 1.2 million people, households, have invested over $4 billion in things. So what is going on? Well, firstly, people say, yes, but you know, there are feed-in tariffs, nothing like those available in Germany. They basically only pay for the energy you put into the grid about what it costs you. There were some small subsidies, but everybody who has expended money on installing those systems knows that the payback period is something in the order of 7 to 10 years. And that depends a bit, of course, on the price of electricity. So nobody is doing this thinking that here's a quick profit. And this is the reason the industry did not believe this would happen, because in most cases, people will only invest in things that have a payback period of less than a year. We've tried in Australia, before we made it legislation under the last government, to get people to change their lights to compact fluorescent lights. Until we made that a requirement, until we legislated for that, it didn't happen because the payback period was longer than a year. Here we have people investing in things with 5 to 10 years. So what's happening? Many surveys in Australia, and I don't think that we're that unusual, actually. There are some extreme things about Australia, and I'm going to come to some other ones in a minute. But what surveys show is that most people in Australia have this complete divide about the future that they want and the future that they believe they will get. Interestingly, in the election that we've just had, the most indicative polling came not from asking people who they were going to vote for, but who they thought they would get. In other words, what other people were doing. A complete divide that comes out in the most extraordinary way time and time again on surveys that show that people want one thing but are convinced that things are going in a different direction. In other words, that in Australia at least, and again, I really insist that I don't think this is just Australia, the sort of collective experience of life is one of cognitive dissonance, of wanting one thing, of thinking one thing, of desiring one thing and knowing that that's not what you're going to get. And of course, if this is true, if this is a fundamental part of the experience, then that's a major disruptive force any time that something happens that enables people to reduce, to collapse that dissonance, and to take an act which is brings together what they want and what they might is going to happen. Now, we all know that engagement, we know this in the case of this program, we know that engagement is partly to do with the ability to have agency to change. And in the case of photovoltaic cells and many other examples I could give to do with water and food and other areas, people found an agency to act. An agency to act towards what they want rather than where they think things are going. But the other thing about change is, and it's very important and critical to this project, is that people change also because we act as a group. We are the other really dynamic and important aspect of change is communion. It's to do it with other people. And in fact, the one important thing perhaps about solar PV panels on roofs of houses in Australia is its symbolic element. That you take an act, you put that there, you invest your money in it, you show the neighbours start to copy, and in fact, all of the data about the growth of these panels shows that it comes out around communities. It spreads amongst neighbours because it becomes a kind of symbolic representation of something you are doing that you can join with your neighbours. I could tell the story about water. It's very similar, but I don't have the time. Okay, so that's just a general kind of thing that I think is common. Let me talk about one other thing I think is common and critical, and that is cities. You know, for most of us, more than 50% of the world today, we live in cities. And we do so apparently because cities are not just, as they are in some parts of the world, where you have to go in order to live, but in many parts of the world, people gravitate to cities because that's where they want to be, because it's where they get their identity, it's where they meet, it's where they socialize, it's where they belong in communities. And when things like solar panels and so on proliferate, they do so within that kind of structure of urban living that is represented by cities and the growth in cities. But cities are an immensely vulnerable thing when it comes to climate change, because cities depend absolutely on the weather and the climate for their existence. Firstly, for the systems of provision that make life in cities possible. Energy, water and food, and if you like, transport or mobility, but energy, water and food, critically. The systems that are developed for cities over time have two facets. One is over the last 200 years, they've developed around the expenditure of massive flows of fossil fuels. For all of the solutions to providing water, for providing food, for providing energy, up to this point, for the last 200 years, we have solved all of those problems by just putting in more and more fossil fuels. Do you know, it's estimated now that we are mining 1 million years of those hundreds of million-year-old fossils per year to keep the fossil fuel energy system going. And cities embed those dependencies, the dependency on fossil fuels. But they also embed things about the nature of the weather conditions, the average weather conditions that have been there over a long period of time in terms of the seasons, the winter and summer temperatures. You know, we build structures in cities, by and large, to cope with the variability that historically has been that of that city. The cities exist where there's water, always because the city needs water. They also exist where there's land, fertile land for production. Now, as weather changes, all of that shifts in a way that can make cities immensely vulnerable. And in many, many parts of the world, in many of the cities that we've worked in, not just in Australia, but in Europe, in the work that we do, the drivers for change are the brittleness, the vulnerability of existing infrastructure to cope with the changes which are already evident. Now, in Australia, this is quite an extreme because our Climate Commission, the old Climate Commission that will just continue now, this is now a crowd-funded poster, no longer a government-funded poster. This talks about last year, this last summer, and in Australia, in just 90 days, 123 things were broken. 123 records, they are about extreme temperatures. In the centre of Australia for the last 2 years, we've had to define a new temperature range, one that goes from 45 degrees to 55 degrees, because at periods we hit 50 degrees. That has never existed before. There's a whole new system has had to be brought in. But we have sea level and storms, we have deposits of rain, we have drought. We have all of that, and it disrupts and has disrupted our cities to an extreme extent that a city like the one that I come from, Melbourne, but you could say the ones further up north, Brisbane, and also Sydney, have been brought to a halt as these extremes of weather or the changes in weather pattern have shifted from that which has been historically the case. Okay, what we do in our work, and I'm not going to take you through that in detail, but we have teams of researchers, teams of volunteer professionals, mostly design and planning professionals, and up to this stage, over 1,400 master's students in architecture, landscape, urban design, engineering, etc., who've worked with us and worked with communities for long periods of time to try to get that community to understand what kind of changes could take place for a 25-year future that would make that place both in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change somewhere that's sustainable. And this is the diagram that we use when we start talking to communities or talking to designers or talking to government about a shift that we think has to take place from the historical systems of the way that energy, water and food have been delivered, where if this is the production unit for any of those things, over time it's got bigger, it's got more and more distant from where the resource is being sent to, and the transfer is just one way. It's from production to all of us at the other end, whose role in that cognitive dissonance world is not as citizens, but as passive consumers. Consumers completely disassociated from the nature of the production of what it is we are consuming. And it is these long chains, as well as the changing weather conditions where things are produced, that have been most vulnerable, that have broken down as weather patterns change. So our what if, with all of these communities and our designers, is what if the world looked like this at the bottom, which is, of course, the fundamental paradigm shape of this project, or the internet, or communications. What if it all looked like a distributed network? What if in each of these areas here, we are talking not just about nodes of transfer of information, but of the production of food, or the production of energy, or the production of water, in all of those? What if that future was dramatically more localized in terms of localized economies, in terms of local production and consumption, and in terms of the diversity that comes from the fact that if you are localizing, then you are utilizing whatever the resources are that is most appropriate. And then what we do is a whole lot of work with communities to talk about those 25-year futures, and we utilize the skills of our researchers in terms of modeling and analysis of the challenges, and then these design professionals, but most importantly the master's students, many of whom themselves are professionals, to work with the community to sort out 25-year futures, and we do this sort of stuff. And we've been doing this sort of stuff for 6 years in Australia, in parts of cities in Australia, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in cities, in those places. And these are all Australian examples. And sometimes, you know, it's very important to be able to show people that what is currently the fixed physical aspects, the physical morphology of their existence can change. And these don't have to be projections of a future. They only have to be the kind of scenarios and visions that get people to think that maybe the future could go in a direction other than business as usual. And if you can make that break, then you start by breaking down that cognitive dissonance. But we do one other thing. After we've done big exhibitions of this, and we've talked to the community, and we've talked to their local representatives and their local government who come to where we set up, very often within the community, to do these visioning design processes. And I'd love to show you photos of us sitting in shops and other things, or in old, now disused council chambers and so on. At the end of all of that, then what we do is to say, okay, if by and large, here are a set of futures which are possible and which are desirable and which are not business as usual, what can we do now to move towards it? And this is what we call eco-acupuncture. Eco-acupuncture. The idea that you can now, on the basis of that vision, begin to design a number of small, low-cost experimental interventions which are based around an assumption that the future is going to be radically, disruptively different in terms of infrastructure. It's going to be a distributed future. And then we give those plans to the community, to the local government, and where the local government can afford it, and increasingly over time, they have afforded it, and increasingly over time, these propositions are what they are building as kind of not just interventions in the standard way, but a bit of living laboratories for how things could be, a very experimental thing. And in one case, for example, this one, with one of the communities we've worked with for the longest in the most difficult part of Melbourne, a part that used to be the manufacturing powerhouse of the state. But all that manufacturing has gone to China. So this is an area that comes up as being the most difficult in socioeconomic terms. And highly multicultural, but actually communities that have come to Australia as refugees and who don't get along and stay in ghettos. So it's an immensely complex problem. And one of the things that came in this process was there is a disused school, a school where they had already made the investment to shift students from really old school infrastructure into a brand new building to combine a number of schools, a great story. But left there is a school. And the council said to us, okay, what will we do with this school? And in this process, and again, I'd love to talk about this at some time, but what came out of that is the idea of a sophisticated food production process that produces both fish and vegetables. What's known as aquaponics, as you might know. You can do that in a system where the runoff from the vegetables, the runoff from the fish tanks go to feed the vegetables and so on. And there is now on the drawing board, if you like, just as a future plan for that school, for an experimental aquaponics centre. Now, we've suggested to that local council that this might be something to try crowdfunding. This comes from a year ago, and it's still sitting there because of political disruption and economic disruption in Australia. Not much has happened. If the timing works out, this is a perfect challenge for this new platform. The design of a low-cost, sophisticated aquaponic centre for a community of 10,000 people, a suburb of 10,000 people, within the confines of an existing school and relying on and using water, rainwater collected off a number of roofs of large buildings nearby. And depending a bit on the timing of Sustainability Maker, what we have said to the local council is, here is a possibility for a way that you might approach this. Okay, just one more thing to say, and then I'll finish. One of the things that you might find interesting is just how strong the focus is at this moment globally on the role of cities in terms of change agents. And an immense amount has been written about this, about the social innovation, the social interaction, which makes cities such creative and vital places in terms of being able to innovate their way out of the future. Also, it's cities, since some of us were in Copenhagen at the failed conference in Copenhagen, and while nations debated, argued, swore at each other in the main hall, there was another whole deliberation going on with 80 cities. And the message from those 80 cities is, we don't need what's going on at the Bella Centre. All we want is a statement that this is important because our targets are already way ahead of anything that's being considered there. Just recently, post-US crisis, I am finishing, I promise, I'm sorry this is really hard to read, but there's something that I do suggest you read. It makes wonderful reading. It's from the Brookings Institution, historically very, very significant policy and research institution in the United States. So what they say has immense policy implications. And in a book, a publication called The Metropolitan Revolution, they look at 6 cities in the United States where successful outcomes, even in the midst of the economic crisis of the United States, have come from the cities. And they look at how. And I love their quote, which is here. And it says, I'll have to read it to you because I know some of you can't see it, like all great revolutions, the Metropolitan Revolution has begun and been catalyzed by a revelation that cities and metropolitan areas are on their own. The cavalry is not coming. And it is that sense that there is no one out there. Right in America, right at this moment, there's no one out there. There's no one in Congress who can agree to anything. There is nothing being funded. But cities have said, we don't need them. And they're doing it on their own. And there are large numbers of reports of this sort. It just happens to be the most enjoyable to read, which suggests that the kind of innovation which we're thinking of is going to come from within cities. And I do hope that with Sustainability Maker we can ensure that a number of the challenges are city challenges. Thank you.